The dust had barely settled on her husband's grave when Birdie Covington packed everything she owned into a single leather trunk, purchased a one-way train ticket from St. Louis, and set her jaw toward a piece of land in the New Mexico territory she had never once laid eyes on. That was the spring of 1882, and Birdie was 26 years old, recently widowed, and utterly alone in a way that felt like standing at the edge of a canyon with no rope and no one to call to on the other side. Her husband, Clarence Covington, had been dead 11 weeks. The influenza had taken him fast, the way it always did, giving a person just enough time to say goodbye but not nearly enough time to make any real peace with the leaving. He had been 40 years old and had coughed himself hollow in the back bedroom of their rented house on Maple Street, while Birdie sat beside him and held his hand and told him everything was going to be fine, which was the most generous lie she had ever told. Clarence had not been a romantic figure. He had been a practical man, a bookkeeper by trade, with ink-stained fingers and a tendency to eat his supper in silence while studying numbers in a ledger. He had been kind to Birdie in the way that a man can be kind without ever quite understanding the person sitting across the table from him. He had provided. He had been faithful. He had never once raised his voice to her. And when he died, she had grieved him with a sorrow that felt real but also, if she was honest with herself in the dark hours of the night, tangled up with something that was not quite grief at all, something more like the terrifying freedom of a door swinging open on a room she had forgotten existed. It was the attorney, a thin-lipped man named Gideon Potts, who had told her about the land. Clarence, it seemed, had inherited 240 acres in Colfax County, New Mexico, from a distant uncle he had rarely spoken of. The uncle's name had been Rutherford Covington, and he had been a rancher, or had attempted to be one, and the land sat along a creek called Sorrow Creek, a name Birdie found either deeply appropriate or deeply ominous, depending on the hour. Gideon Potts had explained that the property was legally hers now, passed to her as Clarence's widow through a clean line of inheritance. He had also explained, with the practiced neutrality of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it had stopped tasting like anything, that the land had been somewhat unoccupied since Rutherford's passing 2 years prior, and that her best course of action would be to travel out and assess the situation in person before making any decisions about a sale. Birdie had asked him if she could simply sell it without going. Gideon Potts had pushed his spectacles up his nose and said that, technically, yes, she could, but that the land records were in some small degree of disarray, and it would be far cleaner and more profitable to attend to the matter herself. She had looked at the walls of her rented house on Maple Street. She had thought about the laundry she would need to take in to pay the rent now that Clarence was gone. She had thought about how the woman who lived 2 doors down had looked at her that morning with a particular kind of pity that Birdie found absolutely unbearable, and she had said, "Book me a route." The train had taken her to Raton, and from Raton she had hired a stagecoach, and from the last stage stop she had arranged to ride on the bench of a supply wagon driven by a weathered man named Hector Oyas, who spoke very little and chewed tobacco constantly, and seemed entirely untroubled by the long silences between them. The country they passed through was unlike anything Birdie had ever seen in her life, wide and golden and enormous in a way that made the sky look too large to be real, with mountains to the west that wore snow on their peaks even in late spring and mesas that rose from the earth like the ruins of something ancient. There were cottonwood trees along the creek beds, pale green and shimmering, and the smell of sage was so strong it was almost like a taste. Birdie sat on that wagon bench and felt something shift inside her chest, something small and cautious, like a bird testing the bars of a cage it had lived in so long it wasn't sure anymore if the door was actually open. Hector Oyas deposited her at the end of a long dirt road and pointed down it without ceremony. "Covington land ends at those red rocks," he said, gesturing toward a distant line of sandstone formation. "Creek runs along the east side. House is down the way." Then he clicked his teeth at his mule and drove on, and Birdie stood in the road with her leather trunk at her feet, and the New Mexico sun pressing down on the top of her head like a warm and impartial hand. She picked up her trunk by its handle and walked. The road was rutted from wagon wheels and spotted with horse prints, and the grass on either side of it was short and dry but not dead, dotted here and there with small yellow flowers that Birdie did not know the name of but found herself wanting to. There were fence posts along the left side, old ones, gray and weathered, strung with wire that had gone slack in places but had not been torn down. Someone had been maintaining something out here. The fence was rough, but it was functional, and a gate she passed through had a new latch on it, the iron of it still showing the faint reddish gleam of recent work. She noticed these things because she was a woman who noticed things. Clarence had always said she was too observant, as though paying attention were a kind of excess. But noticing things had always felt to Birdie less like a habit and more like a form of survival. She came over a rise in the land and saw the house. It was not large, but it was solid, a two-story adobe and timber structure with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and a barn set back from it at a comfortable distance, and a corral beside the barn where two horses stood in the late afternoon shade with their tails switching. The yard had been swept. There was a woodpile that was neatly stacked, not haphazard but organized in the way of someone who took care in small things. Smoke was rising from the chimney in a thin, steady thread. In the kitchen garden to the right side of the house, something green was growing in careful rows. Someone was living here. Birdie set down her trunk and stood very still for a moment. Then she straightened her back, smoothed the front of her dark traveling dress, picked up the trunk again, and walked the rest of the way to the porch. She had barely made it up the porch steps when the door opened. The man who stepped out was tall, with the kind of build that comes from outdoor work rather than any deliberate effort, broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with hands that were large and rough-knuckled, and holding a tin cup of coffee as though he had just risen from a chair inside. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two on either side of it, with dark brown hair that was longer than fashion required, and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were the particular sharp, clear gray of a November sky an hour before rain. He wore a plain blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and canvas trousers tucked into worn boots, and there was a leather-brimmed hat hanging on a peg beside the door that had clearly spent many years being worn and set down and worn again. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, "You must be Clarence Covington's wife." It was not what she had expected. She had expected demands or hostility or at least the feigned innocence of a man caught where he should not be. She had not expected to be recognized. "I am," she said, "Birdie Covington, and this is my land." He nodded slowly as though she had confirmed something he had been waiting a long time to hear. "Warren Fairchild," he said, "I've been keeping it safe for you." There was a silence. Birdie looked at him with the full force of her brown eyes, which were the kind of eyes that had an unnerving tendency to see around corners. "Keeping it safe," she repeated, letting the words sit between them like a hand of cards on a table. "Come inside," he said. "I'll explain." She considered him for a moment longer. He did not flinch under the looking. He held his ground the way a man does when he genuinely has nothing to hide, which is a different kind of stillness than the stillness of a man who has a great deal to hide and is very good at it. Birdie had known both kinds, and she could generally tell the difference. She picked up her trunk and went inside. The interior of the house was clean in a spare, functional way, not domestic but careful. There was a fireplace in the main room with a low fire burning against the evening chill, and a table with two chairs, and shelves along one wall that held a small collection of items. A tin of coffee, some dried goods, a folded piece of paper that looked like a map, a Bible worn smooth at the edges. On the floor beside one of the chairs was a pair of saddlebags, open, as though recently returned from a ride. Warren Fairchild set his tin cup on the table and turned to face her, and there was something in the way he stood that was deliberate without being defensive, like a man who has rehearsed what he wants to say, not because it is untrue, but because he understands that the truth requires a particular kind of telling. "I worked for your husband's uncle," he said. "Rutherford Covington. Came up from Texas in 1878 when I was 22, answered a notice he'd posted in Cimarron for a ranch hand. He was a fair man. Not the easiest man I ever worked for, but fair. I stayed on." "And when he died?" Birdie asked. She had sat down in one of the chairs at the table without being invited to, which was something she did deliberately because she was in her own house. "When he died, I was in the middle of the winter," Warren said. "Ground was frozen. Cattle needed tending. There was a section of the north fence that had gone down in a storm, and it needed to be repaired before anything got out into the open range and got lost." He paused. "Rutherford died in January of 1880. I stayed through the winter because leaving the place empty would have been abandonment. Then I stayed through the spring because I wanted to plant the kitchen garden so the soil wouldn't go to weeds. Then I stayed through the summer because I heard there were men sniffing around the property from a land speculator out of Santa Fe who had been watching the legal situation, and I figured if someone was living on the land, it would be harder to claim." "You heard about land speculators," Birdie said. "From the postmaster in Cimarron," Warren said. "His name is Aldous Webb, and he hears things." He said this simply, without embellishment. "I also got a letter from the law office in St. Louis. From a Mr. Gideon Potts." Birdie sat up a little straighter. "Gideon Potts wrote to you. About a year after Rutherford died, he was trying to establish the status of the property. I wrote back and told him the situation, that I was the last working hand on the property, and that I was maintaining it pending contact from the legal heirs." He reached toward the shelf and took down the folded paper, which he brought to the table and unfolded. It was not a map at all. It was a letter, written in a precise hand on cream-colored paper. "He wrote back and told me the inheritance had passed to a Clarence Covington, and that legal matters were being attended to, and that I should continue to maintain the property in a reasonable capacity. I wrote to him twice more after that, in 1881 and in early 1882. His last letter arrived 3 months ago and said that Clarence Covington had passed and that his widow would be contacting me." Birdie took the letter and read it. Gideon Potts, she was now realizing, was a somewhat more competent attorney than she had given him credit for. "He never told me about you," she said. "I can't speak to what he told you," Warren said. "Only what he told me." Birdie set the letter down on the table between them. Outside, the evening was coming in over the land in long, amber shadows, and the horses in the corral were moving quietly, and somewhere not far off, a nighthawk was beginning its descending call. The fire in the fireplace made a small and steady sound. "How long has it been," she said, "since you've been paid?" He looked at her steadily. "Rutherford paid me through the fall of 1879, he said. "After that I made a small arrangement. I've been grazing a few head of my own cattle on the south pasture and selling them in Cimarron each season. It's been enough to cover the costs of keeping the place running and a little left over for myself. I wrote that down too." He went to the saddlebags and took out a small leather-bound ledger, which he brought to the table and opened without any apparent embarrassment. "Every cent spent on the property and every cent earned from it, since January of 1880. I kept records because I knew someday whoever owned this land would want them." Birdie looked at the ledger. The entries were meticulous, written in a hand that was not elegant but was clear and consistent: dates, amounts, descriptions. Fence wire, January 1880. Seed corn, March 1880. Farrier, 4 horses, August 1880. The list went on for page after page, 2.5 years of careful accounting, and the bottom line on the last page of entries showed that the property had cost slightly less to maintain than the grazing income had provided, which meant that Warren Fairchild had essentially been maintaining her inheritance at his own expense and with his own labor for 2.5 years. Birdie looked up from the ledger. Why? She said. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. Because it wasn't mine, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without any of the calculation she had been bracing for, without the sideways quality that men sometimes had when they wanted something from her. He looked at her the way a person looks at another person when they are simply telling the truth and have nothing else they are trying to accomplish. Well, she said at last, and felt the word coming out different than she had intended it, softer, less guarded. I suppose you had better show me the rest of it in the morning. He nodded. He told her she could have the upstairs bedroom, that he would take the small room off the barn that he had been using since he had moved out of the house a year and a half ago, when the property had been formally assigned to the Covington estate in the legal filings. Birdie told him that was not necessary, that the barn room seemed insufficient, and she was not going to displace a man from a proper bed for the sake of formality. He told her the small room suited him fine and had for 18 months. They went back and forth on this briefly, and Birdie saw something in the exchange that she liked. He was not deferential in a hollow way, and he was not stubborn in a prideful way. He had an opinion and he said it plainly, and he also listened when she spoke. She let him take the barn room. She lay in the upstairs bedroom that night in the dark, listening to the enormous silence of the New Mexico territory, which was not truly silence at all, but rather a vast, breathing collection of sounds she had no names for yet: insects, wind in the cottonwoods, the distant coyotes performing their impossible harmonics against the sky. The stars through the small window were more stars than she had ever seen in her life, heaped up against the darkness in a careless abundance that made the ordered sky above St. Louis seem like a pale and half-hearted attempt at the same thing. She thought about Clarence. She thought about the ledger on the table downstairs, the 2.5 years of careful columns. She thought about Warren Fairchild's gray eyes and the way he had said, "because it wasn't mine," as though it were the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. She fell asleep to the coyotes and did not dream of St. Louis at all. Morning in Colfax County arrived with a ferocity of light that was entirely different from any morning Birdie had previously experienced. The sun came up over the eastern edge of the land, with an enthusiasm that was almost aggressive, flooding the whole valley in a warm gold that made every blade of grass and every fence post and every piece of red sandstone glow as though lit from inside. Birdie stood on the porch with a cup of coffee that Warren had already made before she came downstairs, the fire built up, the coffee on, his own cup already half drunk, because he had apparently been awake since before the light, and she looked out at what was hers and felt the peculiar weight of ownership settle on her shoulders. It was beautiful land. It was difficult land. It was land that required tending and knowledge and physical effort, and Birdie, who had grown up in Illinois and had spent her adult life keeping house in St. Louis, had exactly none of those things in any practiced form. "How many head of cattle does the property run?" she asked Warren, who was standing at the far end of the porch with his hat on and his coffee cup in his hand. "Rutherford had 80 head when I started," he said. "He sold most of the herd in 1879 when the market was good. There are 12 head left on the property now. 6 of those are mine from the grazing arrangement. The other 6 belong to the estate. There are 2 good horses in the corral and a mule in the barn." Birdie considered this. What does the land need to make it a going concern again? He looked at her with a quiet surprise, not skepticism, just something attentive, as though he was recalibrating something. "Stock, primarily," he said. "The land and water are sound. Sorrow Creek runs reliable even in dry years. The north pasture could carry 50 head easy if the fencing is repaired. South pasture another 30, but cattle cost money." "I have some money," Birdie said. Clarence had a small savings. "Not a great deal, but something." She paused. "I would need to know what you think a reasonable starting investment would look like." He looked at her for a long moment with that steady gray gaze. "You're planning to stay," he said. "I haven't decided that yet," she said honestly. "But I am planning to understand what I have before I decide what to do with it." He nodded. "Then I'll show you the whole place today," he said. They spent the morning walking the property, which was more beautiful and more demanding than Birdie had imagined. Warren showed her the north pasture, where the fence had been repaired with wire and new posts. The work evident in the fresh wood still pale against the old gray of the original posts. He showed her the south pasture where his own small herd of 6 cattle grazed, blocky, red-brown animals that he told her were good quality stock, Hereford cross, bred for the high desert country. He showed her Sorrow Creek, which ran along the eastern boundary of the land between banks of cottonwood and willow, clear and cold and entirely lovely, and Birdie understood immediately and without needing to be told why this was valuable. Water in this country was not a given. Water was the whole thing. He showed her the kitchen garden, which was more extensive than it had appeared from the road, not just a few rows of vegetables but a substantial planting, beans and squash and corn and herbs, a root vegetable section, some berries trained along a section of the fence. He told her he had expanded it each year because the kitchen garden could feed a person through the winter if it was managed well, and it gave him something useful to do in the evenings. "You planted all this yourself," Birdie said. "The first year I did it because it needed doing," he said. "The last 2 years I did it because I like it." He said this without any apparent self-consciousness, the way a man says a thing that is simply true. Birdie looked at the garden and thought about a man alone on this property for 2.5 years, planting things and tending them and writing down numbers in a ledger and repairing fences, waiting for someone to come and claim what was theirs. "Did you ever think about leaving?" she asked. They were walking along the creek by then, under the cottonwood trees, and the light came through the leaves in shifting pieces, and the water made a sound over the rocks that was the most peaceful sound Birdie thought she had ever heard. Warren was quiet for a moment, and she did not rush him. He said, "In the winter of 1881, it was a hard winter and he paused. I was tired, not physically, the other kind of tired." He looked at the water. "But I had put 2.5 years into this place by then, and I knew the land and I knew the water and I knew what it could be. And I thought about walking away from it and I couldn't do it." "Because it wasn't yours to walk away from either," Birdie said. He glanced at her with something surprised and warm in his face. "Something like that," he said. They ate lunch on the porch, bread and dried beans that Warren had cooked that morning, simple but adequate, and Birdie asked him questions about the property and the surrounding country and the town of Cimarron, and he answered them all with the same unhurried thoroughness. And she found herself thinking that she could not remember the last time she had sat with a man, and felt that the information she asked for was being genuinely given rather than filtered or withheld or shaped to serve some purpose she wasn't quite being told about. In the afternoon, she went back inside and wrote 3 letters. One to Gideon Potts informing him that she had arrived and found the property in good order due to the diligence of Warren Fairchild, whom she intended to formally retain as ranch manager at a proper wage, pending her decision about the property's future. One to her older sister in Decatur who would be wondering what had happened to her, and one to a cattle broker in Cimarron whose name Warren had given her, inquiring about the current price of Hereford stock. She addressed the envelopes, sealed them, and brought them to Warren and asked if he was riding toward Cimarron soon. He said he had planned to go in 2 days for supplies, and he would post them. She thanked him, and he took the letters carefully and put them in his saddlebag with a matter-of-factness that she appreciated. The next several days settled into a rhythm that surprised Birdie with its naturalness. She rose early, because the light made sleeping late essentially impossible, and also because there was genuinely no inclination in her to lie in bed once she was awake. There was too much to see, too much to learn. Warren cooked breakfast, which she had initially protested, and then accepted with the pragmatic understanding that he was better at it than she was, and that there was no useful pride to be found in an inferior meal. They divided the morning labor. He handled the animals and the physical work of the ranch, and she began the process of understanding the administrative side of things, going through the actual deeds and legal documents that she found in a tin box in the upstairs bedroom, comparing them against Warren's ledger, writing to Gideon Potts again with specific questions about the state of the land title. She also, in a more quietly revolutionary act, began to learn the land itself. She went out with Warren in the mornings and asked him to show her things and name them, and he did, the different grasses and what they meant about the soil, the way the creek changed its character between seasons, the red rock formations along the southern boundary that served as landmarks, the particular behavioral patterns of the cattle, the way the weather came in from the northwest, and what the clouds looked like before a genuine storm versus before a rain that would pass quickly. He was a patient teacher in the way that only people who genuinely love what they know can be. She learned that the coyotes were not something to fear. She learned that the silence she had found so overwhelming that first night was in fact full of information, if you listened to it right. She learned that the yellow flowers along the roadside were called plains coreopsis, and that the bees liked them especially, and that there was a hive in the old elm tree at the northwest corner of the property that had been there since Rutherford's time, and that produced honey if you handled it carefully, which Warren did once a year in August. She did not make the decision about selling the land. She kept not making it, day after day, and she began to understand that the not making was itself a kind of decision. On the 6th day after her arrival, Warren came in from town with the mail and the supplies and her letters' responses, and also with news that made Birdie's pleasant new rhythm stumble hard. He set a sealed envelope on the table in front of her, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that told her before she opened it that it was not good news. The letter was from an attorney in Santa Fe, not Gideon Potts but another one, a man named Harlan Voss, and it was written on behalf of a land development company called the Southwestern Territories Land Company, which was apparently a corporation backed by investors in Denver and Albuquerque, and it informed Birdie with a smooth and oily courtesy that the company had become aware of the Covington estate land in Colfax County and wished to make an offer for its purchase. The offer was for $120, for 240 acres with a creek on it. Birdie read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the table and looked at Warren. $120, she said. The land is worth at least 10 times that, he said. He was not angry, his voice was level, but there was a tightness around his jaw that told her he was controlling something, probably more with the water rights. This is the speculator you mentioned, she said, the one you heard about from the postmaster. Harlan Voss has been buying up land in this county since 1880, Warren said. He sat down in the other chair at the table, which he did not usually do without being invited. He was careful about space, she had noticed, careful about not presuming, but he did it now, and she understood that the thing on the table was serious enough to set formality aside. He approaches widows and single women especially. He approaches people who are newly arrived and don't know what they have. He offers a sum that sounds like a lot of money to someone who doesn't know the country, and then he takes the land and sells it to the development company for 10 times what he paid. That is not going to happen, Birdie said. He looked at her and something settled in his face, not relief exactly, but something that had been waiting to settle and now could. No, he said. I didn't think it would. I'll need you to help me write a proper response, she said. Something that makes it clear I know what the land is worth and that I am not interested in selling at any price below fair market value, and that I have a ranch manager who is well acquainted with the local legal landscape and with the land itself. He looked at her for a moment. You've decided to keep it, he said. She realized as he said it that she had, and that the decision had actually been made some days ago, probably around the time she had stood under the cottonwood trees by Sorrow Creek and listened to the water and felt something inside her chest unwind like a long-held breath. I have, she said. They wrote the letter together that evening, Birdie drafting it in a hand that was clear and deliberate and Warren reading each sentence and sometimes suggesting a phrase that was more precisely legal or more specifically local. And the resulting document was, Birdie thought, quite good firm without being hostile. informed without being boastful, and absolutely clear in its refusal. She sealed it herself and addressed it to Harlan Voss in Santa Fe, and gave it to Warren to post on his next trip to Cimarron. That evening, with the letter dispatched, a particular lightness settled over the porch as the sun went down in colors that were too extravagant to be believed, deep orange and red, and a particular shade of violet along the peaks to the west that Birdie had no name for. Warren brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair, and they watched the sunset together without talking much, which was not an uncomfortable silence, but rather the kind of silence that exists between people who have already said enough important things for one day and are content to let the world fill in the rest. "Can I ask you something personal?" Birdie said when the light had gone mostly down and the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky. "You can ask," he said. "Do you have family? Somewhere, people you left behind to come to New Mexico?" He was quiet for a moment. "My parents died when I was 15, he said. "Fever, same winter. I have a brother in Texas near Laredo. We write sometimes." He paused. "There was a woman years ago when I first came to New Mexico, but she married someone else. She was right to. I wasn't ready to be what she needed." Birdie looked at the stars. "What was she needing?" "Someone who would stay in one place," he said. "I kept thinking I would move on, find something. I didn't know then that what I was looking for was this." He gestured at the land and at the creek and the fence and the barn, but the gesture also somehow encompassed all of the work he had put into it, the 2.5 years of choosing to stay. "And now," Birdie said. "Now I know," he said simply. They sat a little longer in the dark, and when the chill came fully in, Birdie went inside, and she lay in the upstairs room and looked at the stars through the window and thought about a man who had spent 2.5 years keeping something safe for someone he had never met, because it wasn't his to give away. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the ranch deepened and became more complex. The cattle broker in Cimarron wrote back with prices that were better than Birdie had hoped, and she spent 2 careful evenings with the ledger and her own accounting. She had, after all, been the wife of a bookkeeper, and had absorbed more of that craft than she had ever let Clarence know, working out what she could afford to invest in stock, and what the realistic return would be over 3 seasons. The numbers were not lavish, but they were sound. She discussed the plan with Warren over the kitchen table, unfolding her papers and going through the calculations item by item, and he followed along with a focused attention that she recognized as genuine engagement, and not the polite tolerating that some men practiced when a woman presented a plan. When she was done, he pointed out 2 things she had not accounted for: a veterinary cost that the county's increasing cattle population had driven up, and a water access fee that had been added to the Cimarron River Basin properties. And she adjusted the numbers accordingly, and the plan was still sound, just slightly more conservative in its projections. "We can do this," she said. "Yes," he said, "we can." He said "we," and neither of them mentioned it, and they both knew it had been said. The following week Birdie rode with Warren to Cimarron to meet the cattle broker, a round-faced and affable man named Jesper Holtz, who shook her hand with only a fraction of a second of surprise, and then conducted himself with complete professional courtesy thereafter, which Birdie noted and appreciated. She bought 18 head of Hereford and Hereford Cross cattle at a fair price, and she also bought a second working horse, a strong-bodied bay gelding that Warren looked over with his hands, and his eyes with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely knew what he was looking for before he gave her a nod that meant the horse was sound. While they were in Cimarron, Birdie also arranged to pay Warren Fairchild a proper wage. She went to the land office and spoke with the clerk there, a young man with red whiskers named Davis, and had Warren's status formalized as ranch manager on the property, with a wage drawn from the operating account she had opened at the Cimarron Bank with a portion of Clarence's savings. Warren's ledger-recorded labor over the 2.5 years of his unpaid stewardship had been credited against the cost of his continued grazing rights for his own 6 cattle, which was an arrangement that felt fair to Birdie, and that Warren accepted with a quiet directness that told her he had been hoping for something like this, but had not been willing to ask for it. They ate supper at a small restaurant in Cimarron before the ride home, a modest place with checked tablecloths and a good beef stew, and the woman who ran it, a wide-shouldered woman named Estelle, knew Warren by name and looked at Birdie with a frank and uncomplicated curiosity. "You're the Covington widow," Estelle said, setting down the stew. "Birdie Covington," Birdie said. "Yes." "You're staying?" Estelle asked. Not unkindly, genuinely curious, the way a small community person is curious about additions to the community. "I'm staying," Birdie said, and this time when she said it, she felt nothing uncertain about it at all. Estelle looked at Warren with a brief and very expressive look that said something Birdie could not entirely read, and then she went back to the kitchen and brought them bread, and they ate their supper and talked about the cattle and the plans for the north pasture, and the question of whether to put a second water trough at the south fence line. And it was entirely practical and entirely pleasant. And by the time they rode home under a sky deep with stars, Birdie realized she was deeply, genuinely happy in a way she was not sure she had ever been before. She thought about that as she rode. The happiness was not the thin, nervous happiness of relief. It was not the happiness of escaping something or of a burden lifted. It was the happiness of a life fitting around her in the right shape, like a house that was exactly the size she needed with windows in exactly the right places to catch the morning light. She thought about Warren Fairchild riding beside her in the dark, his horse a quiet presence, the occasional clink of the saddle, and the soft percussion of hooves on dry ground. She thought that she was going to have to be very careful, because she was a woman who had been married less than a year ago, and the mourning period that society required had not yet passed, and she was also a woman who had learned slowly, imperfectly, but learned to pay attention to what was true rather than what was convenient. And what was true was that she felt something when Warren was near her that she had not felt in a long time, and was not entirely sure she had ever felt in that particular clear, strong form. She kept that thought to herself, and rode home under the stars and put her horse in the corral, and said good night to Warren on the porch and went inside. Over the weeks that followed, Harlan Voss wrote again. His second letter was less smooth than the first. The offer was higher, $200 now, still insultingly below value, but the tone had shifted slightly, a little more pressing, a little more pointed. Birdie wrote back again, with the same firm clarity, and this time she included a copy of the formal land registration documents that she had obtained from the county land office in Cimarron, and a note to the effect that she was well aware of the full legal status of her property and the protections afforded to it, and that she had retained local legal counsel. She had not actually yet retained local legal counsel, but she resolved to do so immediately after sending the letter, which she did. A man in Cimarron named Obadiah Price, who had been in the territory since territorial days and whose understanding of New Mexico land law was, according to Aldous Webb the postmaster, essentially encyclopedic. Obadiah Price was a small, energetic man of about 60, with white side whiskers, and a quick mind that darted between topics like a dragonfly over water. He read all the documents Birdie brought him in about 20 minutes flat, made a series of notes in a crabbed hand, and then looked up at her over his spectacles and said, "You've got a clean title, the water rights are attached, and Harlan Voss is a land-grabbing opportunist who has been making a nuisance of himself in this county since 1880. Write to him one more time and tell him you've retained counsel, and any further unsolicited offers will be directed to my office. That'll put the lid on it." It did put the lid on it. Harlan Voss sent one more letter, briefer and cooler, and then went silent. Obadiah Price told Birdie with satisfaction that Voss had turned his attention to a property north of Elizabethtown, where the widow was not, apparently, as well prepared, which Birdie found deeply troubling and was not, ultimately, able to leave alone. She spoke to Warren about it that evening. She told him what Obadiah Price had said, and she said she thought someone ought to warn the widow north of Elizabethtown, and she watched him look at her with that particular expression he had developed, attentive and warm, and tinged with something that might have been amusement at the consistency of her, and he said, "Do you want to ride up there?" "I think we should," she said. They rode to Elizabethtown the following week, a longer ride that took them over ground that was higher and more spare than the Covington land, and they found the widow without much difficulty. Her name was Phoebe Garrett, a small gray-haired woman of about 55 who had been on her property for 30 years and was, it turned out, perfectly aware that Harlan Voss was a shark, because her husband, before he died, had warned her about him specifically. She and Birdie got along immediately and thoroughly, and by the time Birdie and Warren left, Phoebe had Obadiah Price's name and address, and a very clear understanding of what her land was worth, and what to say if Voss came calling again. On the ride home, which was long and easy in the late afternoon light, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains blue-purple to the west and the high desert country all around them smelling of sage and pine, Warren told her that was one of the finest afternoons he had spent in this territory in 4 years. "Because of Phoebe," Birdie said, smiling. "Because you rode 50 miles to warn a woman you'd never met because it was the right thing to do," he said. He was looking at the mountains when he said it, not at her, and his voice was quiet and steady and entirely sincere. Birdie looked at the side of his face, the strong angle of his jaw, the edge of his hat brim, the way the light fell on him, and felt the thing in her chest that she had been carefully managing move sharply, like something that had been still for a long time and had decided it was done being still. "Warren," she said. He turned and looked at her. "I want to say something to you," she said, "and I want to say it plainly because I don't know how to say it any other way." He waited. He was always so good at waiting. "You have been the finest man I have ever met in my life," she said. "And I mean that in every practical sense, in the way you kept this land and managed it and recorded it and defended it. But I also mean it in a way that has nothing to do with the land." She paused. "I am aware that I have been a widow for less than a year, and that propriety suggests I ought to wait and be quiet about anything I might be feeling, and I have been trying very hard to do that. But I am 30 miles from home with you in the most beautiful light I have ever seen, and I find that I am not willing to be quiet any more." He had stopped his horse. She stopped hers beside him. They were side by side in the middle of the open road with the mountains at their backs and the land stretching out ahead of them, and he was looking at her with those clear gray eyes that had always seen her straight. "Birdie," he said, and his voice had something in it that had not been there before, something that she recognized as the sound of a man who has been keeping something carefully contained and has just been given permission to let it out. "I have been trying very hard myself." "I know," she said. "I didn't want to be the kind of man who—" He stopped. "You came here alone, and you trusted me, and I did not want to do anything that would make that trust something you would regret." "You could not have made me regret trusting you," she said. "I want you to know that." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, just her hand, and the touch of it sent something through Birdie that was warm and clear and entirely right. They stayed like that for a moment, and then he let go, and they rode the rest of the way home in a different kind of silence. Not the careful silence of two people managing their distance, but the warm, humming silence of two people who have said enough for now and who know that the conversation has only begun. Summer came to Colfax County with a bright, unstoppable force, and the Covington property Birdie had started calling it simply the Covington Ranch to neighbors and to herself, which was a form of claiming, settled into its working season. The cattle gained weight on the good grass of the north and south pastures. The kitchen garden went into its full, overwhelming productivity, and Birdie spent 2 long weekends putting up preserves and drying vegetables with a cheerful and somewhat chaotic energy that produced a pantry shelf that Warren looked at with quiet satisfaction every time he passed it. He had moved back into the house. Not into the upstairs room, that remained Birdie's. but into the small room at the back of the main floor that had apparently been Rutherford Covington's office, which he had cleared of the old paperwork and furnished simply with a cot and his personal belongings. And the arrangement was practical and comfortable, and also slightly electric in the way that any arrangement is when two people are becoming increasingly important to each other, and are living in close quarters, and are both being extremely careful and respectful about it. They worked together every day. They ate together every morning and every evening. They rode out to check the cattle together, and rode the fence line together, and went to Cimarron together every 2 weeks for supplies and mail. People in Cimarron had begun to speak of them as a unit. She noticed it in the way Estelle at the restaurant greeted them, and in the way Aldous Webb, the postmaster, sometimes addressed letters to Birdie in care of the Covington ranch as though Warren were part of the address, which she supposed in a practical sense he was. Estelle pulled Birdie aside one afternoon in late July while Warren was at the feed store and said, with the directness of a woman who had given up on indirectness some decades ago, "That man is half in love with you, or I am a complete fool, and I am not a complete fool." Birdie felt warmth rise in her face. "He is a good man," she said. "He is the best man I know in this county," Estelle said firmly. "And I know most of them. Don't waste a good man, Birdie. Life is short and the good ones are rare." Birdie thought about that on the ride home. She thought about the evening on the road back from Elizabethtown and the conversation they had had and the way he had taken her hand. She thought about how, since that evening, something between them had softened and deepened in a way that was entirely real and that she was done pretending not to know about. That evening after supper, when they were on the porch in the last light, she put down her mending and looked at him directly. "Warren," she said. "Birdie," he said, and there was something anticipatory in it as though he had been waiting. "I would like you to court me," she said, "properly, in whatever way that means in this county and in this time. I am done waiting for the right moment, because I think the right moment is now, and every moment before it also was." He set down the bridle he had been repairing and looked at her with the fullness of his attention, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen there before, unguarded, entirely open, warm in a way that went straight through her. "I have been wanting to ask you that," he said. "I've been working up to asking you that for about 2 months. "I know," she said. "I could tell. I thought I would save us both the suspense." He laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind, and it was a lovely sound, low and warm, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, and she decided immediately that she wanted to hear it again as often as possible. "Then yes," he said. "With great pleasure. Yes." They began to court in the proper sense, Sunday afternoons in Cimarron, attending the small church service that was held in the saloon on Sundays, because the town did not yet have a church building, which Birdie found entirely characteristic of the New Mexico territory, and which she liked for exactly that reason. They attended the community supper at the Cimarron schoolhouse in August, which was a crowded and cheerful event at which Birdie met most of the people in the surrounding area, and was assessed by all of them with the frank and comprehensive attention of small community people, and was, by the general verdict, approved. Warren danced with her twice, and he danced the way he did most physical things, competently, without showiness, with his full attention on her. It was at the community supper that Birdie also met a family of Jicarilla Apache, whose land bordered the northern edge of the Covington property, along a ridge called Raven's Back. A family headed by a man named Tobias, whose Spanish name covered a name in his own language that Birdie asked for carefully and was given carefully, and she did her best to pronounce it respectfully, which Tobias acknowledged with a nod that told her the attempt had been appropriate. Warren knew Tobias well. They had a long-standing arrangement about water access at the north end of Sorrow Creek that had been made between Tobias's father and Rutherford Covington, and that Warren had continued to honor, and Tobias regarded Warren with the particular quiet respect of a man who has been dealt with honestly over many years and knows the rarity of it. Birdie spoke with Tobias and his wife for a long time that evening, learning things about the land and the water and the seasons from people who had known this country for generations before anyone named Covington had ever laid eyes on it. And she listened with the attention that she brought to everything, and felt the full weight and complexity of what it meant to own land in a territory that had been someone else's home first. It was not a comfortable feeling, and she did not try to make it comfortable. She honored it, the way you honor difficult things by not looking away from them. She and Warren talked about it on the ride home, the full conversation of two people who are thinking hard about something together, and his views aligned with hers in a way that felt significant. He had the same complicated respect for the injustice of the situation, the same refusal to dismiss it, the same understanding that continuing to honor the water arrangement was not charity but basic decency. September came and brought with it a change in the light lower, more golden, long-shadowed, and the land turned the colors of itself. The grass going tawny, the cottonwoods along Sorrow Creek going yellow and brilliant, the red rocks burning in the autumn sun. Birdie had a habit now of going down to the creek every evening before supper to watch the light change, and Warren often came with her, and they would stand or sit on the bank and talk or be quiet in the way that had become the most comfortable thing in both their lives. One evening in late September, he came down to the creek with something different in his face. A tension, not bad tension, but the kind that comes before something important, and Birdie watched him come and understood before he said anything that this was the moment he had been working toward. He sat down beside her on the bank and was quiet for a moment, watching the water. "I have been trying to find the right words," he said. "I am not a man who has an easy time with words in certain situations." "You have been fine with words every other situation," she said gently. "Other situations don't matter this much," he said. The creek ran on. A kingfisher shot upstream like a blue arrow. The cottonwood trees shed their last leaves in a slow, golden falling. "Birdie," he said, "I don't have a great deal of formal education, and I don't have money to speak of beyond what I earn and a small amount I've saved. I have a small herd of cattle and a skill set that is exclusively useful in places like this. What I can offer you is that I know this land as well as any man alive. I know how to work hard and how to keep my word and how to be here when you need someone here." He paused. "I want to marry you. I want to build this place into something real with you. I want to wake up here every morning for the rest of my life and have you be part of that. I want—" He stopped and looked at her directly. "I want everything that word means." Birdie was crying, which she had not predicted and which she did not try to stop. The tears were not sad tears. They were the kind that come when something so right finally happens that the emotion has nowhere else to go. "Warren Fairchild," she said, "you have been keeping this place safe for me for 2.5 years, and I have been keeping this answer safe for you for the last several months." She took his face in her hands, rough and warm and real, and looked at him straight. "Yes," she said, "every part of yes." He kissed her then, with the gentleness of a man who is careful with things he values, and Birdie kissed him back with everything she had. All the loneliness and the courage and the grief, and the long journey from Maple Street to Sorrow Creek, and all the mornings of new light, and all the evenings of stars, and all the plans written in columns in a careful ledger. The cottonwoods shed their leaves around them, and the creek ran cold and clear, and the mountains stood at their backs, and it was the most completely right moment Birdie Covington had ever been inside of. They told no one immediately, because there were things to do first. Warren rode to Cimarron and spoke with Obadiah Price about the formalities, the property status, the question of Warren's legal relationship to the land after marriage, the need to ensure that Birdie's ownership was in no way diminished or absorbed, because the law in 1882 had a variety of opinions on the property rights of married women that Birdie was not prepared to simply accept. Obadiah Price handled this with the same crackling efficiency he brought to everything, and produced a document that established Birdie's absolute co-ownership of the Covington Ranch and her independent right to conduct its business, which Warren signed without a moment's hesitation or resentment, because of course he did. They told Estelle first, because Estelle had, in a sense, been one of the midwives of it, and Estelle threw her arms around both of them simultaneously in a manner that was aggressive with joy, and then immediately began to talk about the celebration supper she intended to make. They told Phoebe Garrett by letter, and Phoebe wrote back a response that was 3 pages long and effusive, and contained several entirely practical suggestions about running a ranch with 2 people that Birdie read with appreciation. They told Tobias when they rode out to meet him about the winter water arrangement, and he looked at both of them with a quiet and knowing expression, and said something in his own language to his wife that made her smile and look at Birdie with warm eyes. And then he said in Spanish, which Warren translated, that this land had been a good land for a long time and would continue to be one. The wedding was in November, which suited Birdie because she had never been a woman who dreamed of elaborate ceremony, and which suited Warren because he was a man who was constitutionally averse to fuss. They were married by the circuit preacher who came through Cimarron on the 2nd Saturday of November, in the saloon that served as the town's ceremonial space in the absence of a church, with Estelle and Obadiah Price and Jesper Holtz the cattle broker, and Aldous Webb the postmaster as witnesses, and the whole gathering afterward turned into a party that was merrier than Birdie had expected and longer than she had planned. And she danced 3 times with Warren, and once with Obadiah Price, who turned out to be surprisingly light on his feet, and she felt the happiness of it settle through her in layers, the immediate happiness of the party and the food, and the music from the fiddle player, who had appeared from somewhere, and underneath that the deeper happiness of a life taking the shape it was supposed to take. They rode home that evening under a November sky that was clear and absolutely full of stars, and the land was theirs in a new way now, both of them and neither of them owning it more than the other, and the house was lit from inside with the low fire they had left burning, and Birdie thought that there was no more beautiful sight in the world than light in the windows of the house you are coming home to. Winter came with force that year. Colfax County winters were serious. Warren had told her, and he had been entirely truthful about that. The snows came in December and piled up against the barn and the corral and the fence posts, and turned the whole country into something still and white and enormous. And they were indoors more than out, working in the warmth of the main room at the table with the fire going and the smell of coffee always in the air. Birdie cataloged the pantry supplies, planned the spring planting, wrote to seed merchants in Albuquerque, and spent her evenings reading. She had brought a good supply of books from St. Louis in her trunk, which had seemed excessive at the time and now seemed like one of the best decisions she had ever made. Warren read too, which surprised her initially, and then did not. He had a practical intelligence and a genuine curiosity about the world that made reading a natural fit, and they would sit on either side of the fire in the long winter evenings with their books and their coffee and their occasional commentary to each other about what they were reading. And it was one of Birdie's favorite things about being married to him, that the silences were as good as the conversations, that both kinds of time felt like the same kind of close. In the deep of December, Warren rode out to check on the north herd and whether that was colder than it should have been, and came back 3 hours later with a face red from wind and the news that one of the fence sections on the north boundary had gone down under heavy snow, and 3 of the cattle had drifted through onto the open range. He was already planning to go back out with tools and supplies to repair it and find the cattle, and Birdie put on every warm layer she owned and went with him. He protested briefly, and she said she was not staying inside while her cattle were on the open range and her fence was down, and his expression said something between exasperation and profound tenderness, and then he handed her an extra pair of his gloves and they went. They found all 3 cattle within half a mile, huddled in a draw against the lee of a sandstone formation, which Warren said was actually sensible behavior for cattle in this country. They repaired the fence in wind that was cold enough to make Birdie's eyes water constantly, and Warren worked with the efficiency of long practice, and she handed him wire and held posts, and passed him the pliers, and they did it together in less time than she would have thought possible. On the ride back, her face numb and her fingers aching inside the doubled gloves, she felt something that she thought might be the best feeling she had ever had, the specific satisfaction of having done something genuinely hard alongside someone you loved. "I could not have done this without you today," she told him, which was true, and also only a small part of what she meant. He looked at her sideways from under his hat brim, and his face was red with cold, and his eyes were warm, and he said, "I know. That's the point." She laughed, and her breath made a cloud in the freezing air, and the cattle walked ahead of them through the snow, and the house was below them with its light in the windows, and everything was exactly as it should be. By the time the spring of 1883 arrived and the land greened up again along Sorrow Creek, and the cottonwoods leafed out in their pale, shimmering way, and the yellow coreopsis came back along the road, Birdie knew she was expecting a child. She told Warren on a morning in April, standing in the kitchen garden where she had been deciding where the squash should go, and he was standing in the barn doorway with a halter in his hand, and she just said it, that they were going to have a baby in October, by her accounting. He stood very still for a moment, and she watched something happen in his face that was one of the most extraordinary things she had ever seen. A kind of joy that was too large for ordinary expression, too genuine for any kind of performed reaction, just the pure and overwhelming reality of it moving through him. He put down the halter and crossed the yard to her and took her in his arms and held her there in the kitchen garden in the April morning with the smell of new earth and new growth all around them, and she felt his heart beating under her cheek fast and sure. "Are you well?" he said, pulling back to look at her. "Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am excellent." "Good," he said. "Good," and then helplessly, "A baby." "A baby," she confirmed. He kissed her forehead and her face and then her mouth, and then stood back and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been given the most extraordinary gift and is not yet sure he has grasped the full extent of it. That spring and summer were full and good. Birdie expanded the kitchen garden extensively, because there was going to be more than 2 of them to feed, and she ordered a supply of medical texts from an Albuquerque bookseller, because she was determined to go into this as informed as possible. Warren added a 3rd room to the house. He was good with his hands, and the territorial style of construction was practical and adaptable, and it was a proper room off the main floor, with a window toward the eastern morning light, and he built a crib for it from the same timber as the room because wood from the same source would make the grain match, which Birdie found so characteristic of him that she had to leave the room briefly to collect herself. They had a good cattle season. The north pasture herd had grown to 30 head, the south to 22, and prices in Cimarron were steady. Warren hired a young man from town for the summer, a 17-year-old named Felipe whose family lived south of Cimarron, and who was diligent and willing, and whom Warren taught with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. Birdie paid Felipe fairly, which he communicated to his family, which meant that when they needed help the following year they had 4 candidates to choose from, which was the kind of return that comes from treating people decently. Obadiah Price came out to the ranch in August with an updated set of property documents that reflected several improvements they had made, and that formalized the water rights agreement with Tobias's family in a written form that both parties had agreed to, which Obadiah said would stand up to any legal challenge from any land speculator in the territory, and which Tobias reviewed with an attorney from Taos before signing, because he was, as Warren said admiringly, a man who was careful about agreements, and rightly so given the history. In October, 3 weeks before the date Birdie had calculated, their son was born. He came on a Tuesday morning, fast and determined, which Estelle, who had ridden out from Cimarron at the first word because she was not missing this for anything, said was a very good sign. A baby who knew what it wanted and moved accordingly. The local midwife, a woman named Conception Reyes who had delivered half the children in the county, was calm and efficient and completely in charge, and Warren stayed near enough to hear but far enough to be useful when Conception needed things, which was exactly the right place for him to be, and he knew it. They named him Rutherford Henry Fairchild, Rutherford for the man whose land and whose last responsible act had set all of this in motion, and Henry for Warren's father, and Fairchild for the man who had spent 2.5 years keeping a place safe for a woman he had never met. Birdie held Rutherford Henry against her chest in the afternoon light that came through the window toward the east, with the cottonwoods visible from where she lay and the sound of Sorrow Creek just barely audible if she was quiet enough. And she thought about the woman who had stood on the road with a leather trunk at her feet and not known a single thing about this land or this life or any of the people now filling it. She thought about the letter in the tin box upstairs, Gideon Potts's precise handwriting, directing her toward a piece of land in the New Mexico territory that had turned out to contain not just 240 acres and a creek, but an entire life she had not known she was supposed to be living. Warren came in quietly, the way he always moved when he was being careful about something, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them with that wide, open expression that she had now come to associate with the moments when he felt too much to contain it. "He has your eyes," Birdie said. "He has your forehead," Warren said. "He's going to be very smart." He said this with complete confidence as though it were simply information. "And stubborn," Birdie said. "And stubborn," Warren agreed, smiling, "which he also gets from you." She laughed carefully because laughing was still a tender activity, and Warren reached out and touched the baby's tiny curled fist where it rested against Birdie's collarbone, the way you touch something very small and very new when you are afraid of your own size. "Rutherford Henry," he said quietly. "Welcome to Sorrow Creek." The name felt right. It had always felt right. Actually, Sorrow Creek was not a sorrowful place, or it had not been since Birdie had arrived and begun filling it with the business of living. But the name was honest and old and belonged to the country, and the country deserved to be called by its honest names. Estelle stayed for 2 days and cooked everything in the pantry into a series of meals that would last a week, which was deeply practical and deeply affectionate, and when she left she cried, which she would have denied energetically if anyone had mentioned it. Conception Reyes visited twice the following week to check on both mother and child, and declared everything excellent, and Birdie thanked her with the same genuineness she brought to everything, and pressed her fee into her hand without the haggling that some people apparently practiced, which Conception accepted with a warm, direct look. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was the best winter Birdie could remember. There was the baby Rutherford Henry, who had the Fairchild gray eyes and the Covington stubbornness exactly as predicted, and who was plump and loud and deeply, luminously healthy. And there was the house, warmer now with 3 people in it, and there was Warren, who was an extraordinarily good father in the way that sensible, patient men often are, not performing it, just doing it, quietly and thoroughly and with complete devotion. Phoebe Garrett visited in February, making the long ride from Elizabethtown with a companion for propriety, and arriving windblown and cheerful, and immediately taking Rutherford Henry into her arms with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised children of her own, and held him with complete confidence, while she and Birdie talked for 3 hours about everything from the cattle market to the legal status of water, rights to the best technique for preserving the wild plums that grew along the creek in late summer. Before she left, she kissed the baby's head and told Birdie she was one of the finest women she had met in the territory, which made Birdie feel warm for a week. Spring came again, the 3rd spring of Birdie's time at Sorrow Creek, and she walked out to the kitchen garden on a morning in April with Rutherford Henry on her hip, 6 months old and deeply interested in the garden because he was deeply interested in everything. And she stood in the garden and looked at the land. The fence posts straight and true, the pastures greening, the mountains to the west still wearing a little snow. Sorrow Creek catching the early light along its eastern bank, and she felt the fullness of it all the way through her, from the soles of her feet to the top of her head. Warren came across the yard from the barn, moving in that easy, familiar way of his, and she watched him come the way she always watched him, with attention and pleasure, and a kind of gratitude that was bigger than any word she had found for it. He came up to her and looked at the garden and took Rutherford Henry from her hip with the practiced smoothness of a man who had gotten good at the transfer, and the baby grabbed at his hat and he let him, which he always did, and the hat ended up at an angle. "The creek level is high," he said. "More snowmelt than last year. The south pasture is going to need the supplemental drainage dug out, or we'll have standing water in the low corner." "I'll look at it with you this afternoon," Birdie said. He nodded. He always just nodded because she was always just there. Not a surprise, not an accommodation, just a fact of how the work got done and how the life worked. It was the finest thing she could think of, to be the person whose presence is simply assumed because the world functions better with you in it. She looked at him with the hat at its ridiculous angle and the baby pulling at the brim and the morning light on his face, and thought that she would like to remember this moment precisely as it was, the smell of the spring earth and the sound of the creek and the mountains and this man and this child, and all of it hers in the way that only the things you have genuinely chosen can ever be truly yours. "Warren," she said. He looked at her over the top of Rutherford Henry's head. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping it safe for me." He looked at her for a moment with those clear gray eyes, and then he said what he had said on the day she arrived, which was not a repetition but a completion. It was worth keeping. She took his free hand, and they stood there in the garden in the April morning, the three of them, while the cottonwoods along Sorrow Creek put on their new leaves in the patient, seasonal way they had been doing since long before anyone named Covington or Fairchild had come to this land, and would go on doing long after, as sure and reliable as water and as necessary as the light. The years that came after were full years, built ones, the kind that accumulate into a life that has weight and warmth and character. The Covington Ranch grew and became known in Colfax County as a well-run property for its fair labor practices, for the quality of its Hereford stock, for the long-standing water agreement that stood as a model for similar arrangements elsewhere in the county. Birdie was known as a woman who paid her debts promptly, dealt honestly, and defended what was hers without drama or apology. Warren was known as a man of his word, which in this territory was the only currency that never depreciated. They had a second child in 1886, a daughter, whom they named Clara June, and she came into the world with the same determined speed as her brother and the same gray eyes, and from her earliest days showed an interest in the cattle that Rutherford Henry had never shared, preferring as he did the kitchen garden and, later, numbers, which he took to with an aptitude that made Birdie think sometimes of Clarence and feel a complicated tenderness about it. Estelle came out for both births. It was simply understood that she would. Tobias's family remained neighbors in the real sense of the word, people whose presence in the territory was ancient and legitimate, and whose knowledge of the land was something Birdie treated as an education she was grateful to receive. The water agreement held, renewed and formalized as needed, and the creek ran through both their lives the way it had always run, constant and cold and indifferent to property lines. Obadiah Price retired in 1887 and recommended his practice to a younger attorney named Samuel Cho, who had come west from San Francisco and who had a similar quick intelligence and a similar impatience with land speculators, and the legal business of the ranch passed seamlessly to him. Harlan Voss made one more attempt on the Covington property in 1885, approaching it through a third party rather than directly this time, and Samuel Cho had the matter disposed of in 2 letters and a filing fee, which felt to Birdie like a satisfying ending to a story that had needed one. On an evening in the late summer of 1888, with Rutherford Henry 5 years old and Clara June 2, and both asleep in their respective rooms with the particular completeness of children who have used up the entire day, Birdie and Warren sat on the porch in the last light, the way they had sat on many hundreds of evenings before, with their coffee and the sound of the creek and the mountains going dark against the western sky. "Do you remember," Birdie said, "what you said to me the day I arrived?" "I said a number of things," Warren said. "You said you had been keeping it safe for me," she said. "I remember," he said. "I think about that a lot," she said. "How strange it was. A man I had never met, keeping a place safe for a woman he had never met for years because it was the right thing to do. It didn't seem strange at the time," he said. "It seemed like the obvious thing. That's what makes it extraordinary," she said, "that you found it obvious." He looked at the mountains in the fading light, and she looked at the side of his face, and thought that she had looked at that face across tables and in early mornings and late nights and in cold weather and in the heat of full summer, and she had never once looked at it and felt anything other than what she felt now, which was that she was looking at the center of her own life and finding it exactly as she had always needed it to be. "Birdie," he said, still looking at the mountains. "Warren," she said. "I want you to know that I would do it again," he said. "Every fence post and every ledger entry and every winter and every letter to Gideon Potts, all of it." "I know," she said. "Not because I knew you were coming," he said. "I didn't know that. I just knew the land deserved to be cared for, and whoever belonged to it deserved to find it as it should be. And when I arrived," she said, "did I seem like what you had been keeping it safe for?" He turned and looked at her then fully, the way he had looked at her that first evening on the porch when she had set down her trunk and met his eyes. "More than I had any right to expect," he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, the same way he had taken hers on the road back from Elizabethtown all those years ago, and his fingers closed around hers with the warm certainty of everything that had followed from that gesture and everything that would follow from it still. The creek ran on in the dark beyond the yard. The mountains settled into their nighttime silhouettes against a sky that was beginning to fill again with stars, the same stars that had been there the first night she arrived, the same extravagant heap of them against the dark. The horses in the corral made their quiet, contented sounds. Inside the house, the 2 children slept in their rooms in the easy safety of a life that had been built for them with intention and care. Sorrow Creek was not a sorrowful place. It had not been for some years now, not since a woman named Birdie Covington had come down a dusty road with a leather trunk and found a man named Warren Fairchild on the porch of her inherited house, holding a tin cup of coffee and telling her, with a simplicity that turned out to be one of the most extraordinary things she had ever heard, that he had been keeping it safe for her. It had been worth keeping. All of it had been worth keeping. Every single piece.